You're about to hear 4 words a trained federal agent said to their partner in the dark in October 2023. 4 words that ended up in an official Pentagon file. 4 words that, once you understand exactly where this agent was standing when they said them, are going to change the way you look at the sky tonight. But hold on, before you get there, you need to understand something the government itself buried at the bottom of a much longer report, and I promise you, it's stranger than the sentence in the title. Picture this: you're a federal agent, years of training, you've been taught to describe exactly what you see, in flat, precise language, because your report might end up in a courtroom. Your job depends on never exaggerating, never speculating, never letting your imagination take the wheel. And one night, standing guard near one of the most classified pieces of real estate in North America, you turn to the person next to you and you can't help yourself. You ask them if they're seeing what you're seeing. Not because you doubt your eyes. Because you need someone else to confirm you haven't lost your mind. That's not a campfire story. That's a documented statement, sitting inside a Pentagon case file released to the public in June 2026. And here's the part that should stop you cold. This wasn't one agent's account. It was 6 independent testimonies describing the same impossible sequence over 2 separate nights above a mountain that was built, specifically, to make sure nothing unexplainable could ever cross into that airspace without being caught. By the time you finish this video, you're going to know exactly what these agents watched happen in the sky, what the Pentagon's own investigators tried, and failed, to explain, and why one of the most fortified locations on the entire continent ended up with a government memo admitting that 40% of what happened there still has no answer. But to understand why that admission matters this much, you first need to know exactly what's underneath that mountain, because it isn't just a mountain. Here's what you're not being told yet, and it's the detail that turns this from strange lights into something that should genuinely concern you. FBI interviews tied to this case place the activity near Cheyenne Mountain, just outside Colorado Springs. Under roughly 2,000 feet of solid granite sits a fortified command complex built to survive a direct nuclear strike, the Alternate Operations Center for NORAD and U.S. Northern Command. This is the exact infrastructure the United States built during the Cold War for one single purpose: to make sure nothing enters North American airspace without someone noticing immediately. Now hold that thought, because it matters more than it sounds like right now. The agents on duty that October weren't investigating anything unusual. They were doing routine security work, the kind of quiet, uneventful overnight shift that makes up 99% of federal protective duty. Nobody expected to end up giving a sworn account to the Pentagon's newly formed anomaly unit, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, known as AARO, the office created specifically because military and federal personnel kept reporting things nobody could categorize. And that's exactly why this case is different from the videos you've probably already scrolled past 100 times. This isn't a shaky phone clip from a stranger on the internet. This is a formally documented account from professionals trained specifically to be skeptical of their own senses, sitting directly above the exact command center built to detect the very thing they say they saw. Wait, because it's about to get stranger than the orbs themselves. When a report like this lands on an investigator's desk, they don't start with mystery. They start with a checklist, the most boring, most statistically likely explanations first: flares, aircraft, drones, weather. That's exactly where AARO's analysts started too. Military flare activity looked promising at first, and investigators did conclude it could plausibly explain part of what was reported. Case closed, right? Except aircraft exhaust was specifically tested next, and ruled out completely, because the altitude and behavior of the objects didn't match anything an engine could produce. Then came drones. Also considered. Also discounted, because what these agents described didn't loiter the way a drone loiters, and it didn't move like anything remotely piloted from the ground. So here's where the simple story falls apart, and this is the detail that made investigators sit up. According to the agents' own accounts, cited directly in AARO's summary, this wasn't one static light in the sky. It was a bright orange sphere the agents themselves started calling a mother orb, appearing for 1 or 2 seconds at a time, releasing a small cluster of red objects, and vanishing, only to come back later and do it again. Multiple times. Over several hours. That is not a flare. That is not exhaust. And once investigators crossed those explanations off the list one by one, this stopped being a routine case file. Now meet the people who actually watched this happen, because their credibility is the entire reason this case didn't get buried like thousands of others. At least 6 federal agents gave independent accounts to AARO connected to this event, and investigators specifically cross-checked their descriptions against each other before drawing any conclusions. One agent, in language cited directly in the released file, compared the discharge pattern to grapes being expelled from a basketball, not poetic language, just the most precise physical comparison this trained observer could find for something that had no obvious real-world equivalent. Another witness, identified only as Witness 4, watched the smaller orbs get released from the larger orange light again and again, and told investigators they lost count after the 5th occurrence. And then, this is the moment. Mid-observation, one agent turned to their partner and asked, simply, "Are you seeing this?" Sit with that for a second, because it's easy to skim past. That sentence isn't in any training manual. It's not procedural language. It's the sound of a professional, in real time, needing external confirmation before their own brain would accept what was in front of them. In a job built entirely on composure under pressure, that unscripted question might be more revealing than every page of formal testimony that came after it. Here's exactly what the Pentagon says happened, laid out with the precision investigators used to build the case file. According to a June 2026 summary memo authored under AARO Director John T. Kozlowski, the phenomenon played out over 2 separate nights in October 2023, near the site later tied by FBI interviews to Cheyenne Mountain. Consistent enough across both nights that investigators treated it as one connected event, not 2 coincidences. The pattern repeated itself with unsettling regularity. A luminous orange sphere would appear abruptly, hold for only a second or two, release a cluster of 2 to 4 red objects into the sky, and then disappear, sometimes returning hours later to do the exact same thing again. You're not looking at a single sighting here. You're looking at a repeated, almost deliberate sequence, playing out across an entire night. To move past eyewitness memory, AARO cross-referenced the timeline against commercial and military flight logs, radar returns, spatial distance estimates, and ADS-B transponder data, the same tracking backbone used to monitor nearly every registered aircraft in U.S. skies. Investigators specifically confirmed the objects were operating at altitudes inconsistent with any known exhaust behavior. Every conventional identification method was thrown at this case, and it didn't fully break. So if it's not flares, not exhaust, not a drone, what's left? This is where the case stops sounding like a UFO story and starts sounding like a national security review. Foreign adversary technology was formally considered. Given how close this all happened to sensitive defense infrastructure, investigators had to ask the obvious question. They assessed it as highly unlikely, based on the known technical capabilities of the countries that would realistically have both the motive and the means to test surveillance hardware directly above Cheyenne Mountain. Meteorological and atmospheric explanations were also examined and set aside: weather balloons, ball lightning, satellite debris, all the categories that quietly explain the overwhelming majority of anomaly reports worldwide, closed off one by one. Here's what that leaves you with. AARO didn't dismiss this case. They didn't file it under insufficient evidence and move on. Their own report states plainly that no single explanation could account for everything that was witnessed, and that roughly 40% of the reported activity remains, in the agency's own words, unresolved. In a field usually most comfortable operating inside tidy percentages and closed files, that number, written into an official government memo, is not a small thing to admit. You'd think that would be the end of it. It's not, because this case doesn't stand alone, and that's exactly what should be bothering you right now. The same broader release of Pentagon files that included the Mother Orb incident also documented a separate sighting, back in February 2022, above the exact same mountain. 5 U.S. Army personnel reported a shimmering, angular object, described as a non-symmetrical potato made of shifting, irregular panels, hovering roughly 300 to 500 feet above Cheyenne Mountain for up to 3 minutes before it vanished. Investigators floated a possible answer: sunlight bouncing off snow-covered terrain, illuminating low clouds. But even AARO labeled that explanation low confidence, citing real uncertainty about viewing angles, cloud cover, and conditions that day. Their own best guess came with an asterisk attached. Then there's a 2024 FBI interview, buried in the same file, where a former U.S. Army intelligence officer who witnessed a related event over the same site described something almost identical. A creamy white, opalescent shape built from what looked like fish-scale panels, rippling in slow waves across a surface that otherwise stayed perfectly still, right before it disappeared. Different year. Different witness. Same mountain. Same unresolved feeling. Multiple sightings. Multiple years. One location the United States built specifically to never have blind spots. And still, no single, closed answer. Here's the part that should genuinely surprise you, because for decades, none of what you just heard would have ever reached you at all. Cases like this one used to disappear. Filed, classified, forgotten, surfacing only decades later through lawsuits, leaks, or documentaries built on secondhand rumors. That changed in February 2026, when the sitting administration issued a direct executive order instructing the Secretary of War and other department heads to identify and release government files connected to UFOs, calling the material, in their own words, complex but important enough that the public deserved to see it. What followed wasn't a single dump of documents. It was staged, deliberately, like a slow reveal. May 8th, the first tranche. May 22nd, the second. And then, on June 12th, 2026, the third release, the one containing the Cheyenne Mountain files, the AARO summary memo naming its own 40% uncertainty. FBI produced digital renderings of what the agents described, and video interviews taken directly from witnesses rather than sanitized military sensor footage. Stop and actually picture that moment inside the Pentagon. An agency built entirely around classification and caution, sitting down and typing an internal number, 40%, into a memo they knew, eventually, the entire world would read. That's not a leak. That's not a whistleblower. That's the government, on its own terms, publicly admitting the limits of what it understands about its own most protected sky. If this story has a main character that isn't human, it's the mountain itself, and you need to understand what it was actually built to do, because that's what makes this case land so differently. Constructed at the height of Cold War fear, the complex under Cheyenne Mountain was designed to survive a direct nuclear strike and keep functioning as the nerve center for detecting exactly the kind of airspace intrusion this case now describes, just aimed at a threat its Cold War architects never once imagined. Its entire purpose, from the day it was built, has been detection. Nothing was supposed to cross into that airspace without triggering an immediate, traceable response. That's the detail defense analysts have zeroed in on since these files went public. This may have very little to do with whether the orbs were extraterrestrial, and everything to do with a demonstrated gap in America's ability to identify what's actually moving through its most sensitive airspace. You built the most surveilled sky on the continent specifically to eliminate ambiguity. And ambiguity walked right through it anyway, twice, that we know of, in less than 2 years. Here's exactly where this stands right now, as of the most recent disclosure, and I want to be precise with you, because this is where a lot of channels start exaggerating, and you deserve better than that. Neither the Department of War nor AARO has concluded that this case, or any case in the current release, proves extraterrestrial life, non-human intelligence, or alien technology. Officials have repeatedly stressed that unresolved means investigators lack enough information to reach a confident answer, not that they've found one they're hiding. Former AARO director Sean Kirkpatrick has said publicly that cases like this typically stay open not because of secrecy, but because there simply isn't enough corroborating sensor data to close them with confidence. But here's what actually changed, and it's not the mystery, it's the paper trail. For the first time, you have direct access to an internal government memo, naming the exact percentage of a case investigators couldn't close, built from named agents' testimony and cross-referenced radar data. That level of transparency didn't exist in this form even a few years ago. Whatever you believe about what those agents saw, the fact that you're even able to read their words right now is new. So here's where I'll leave you. There's a version of this story that ends with something genuinely beyond our understanding hovering above American soil. And there's a version that ends with a mundane explanation nobody's found yet. Based on everything the government itself has released, you and I genuinely don't know which one is true. And if a channel tells you they do, they're selling you certainty the Pentagon itself refuses to sell. What you do know is this: a trained federal agent, standing guard above the most defended patch of sky in North America, looked up and needed someone else to confirm what their own eyes were telling them. 40% unresolved isn't a headline built to scare you. It's an honest admission, on government letterhead, that certainty has limits, even for the people whose entire job is watching the sky. So next time you look up at a clear night sky, ask yourself the same question that agent asked their partner. Not because you'll see something, but because it's worth remembering how much of what's above you even in the most watched airspace on Earth, still doesn't have an answer.